for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Spider-Man No Way Home, a movie that almost got cancelled because of a financial dispute between Sony and Marvel Studios, until Tom Holland stepped in and forced renegotiations between Sony and Marvel, leading to the production of this movie. And the idea of the narrative in terms of learning about its production has been a very interesting one, because according to some sources, apparently in some really early drafts of this movie, originally the script focused on Peter Parker going on yet another intergalactic adventure with another space-themed character, probably the Skrulls or Captain Marvel, as hinted in the second post-credits scene from Spider-Man Far From Home. However, that storyline was dropped in favor of setting up Secret Invasion. How true this information is, I have no idea. This is my first time even hearing about it, actually. As for the next draft of the movie, according to the director, originally he had this idea where he was going to feature Kraven the Hunter being the primary villain. However, the Sony executives told him to drop the character altogether because they wanted Kraven the Hunter to have his own movie that would be set in the same universe as Morbius in the Venom movies, which I think was a wasted opportunity, which I'll explain later in the review. But anywho, sometime later, the movie director came up with a story idea that was similar to the classic Christmas movie It's a Wonderful Life, in which Peter makes a wish regarding his now public identity. And as production progressed, the pandemic occurred, altering the production for several installments of the MCU. Most notably, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, because Multiverse of Madness was supposed to come out before Spider-Man No Way Home, but due to the pandemic, and the original Doctor Strange director, Scott Derrickson, stepping down as director, with Sam Raimi taking the reins, forced Multiverse of Madness to undergo rewrites and reshoots in order to align with the now current continuity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I'm getting ahead of myself here with Multiverse of Madness. But as far as Spider-Man No Way Home is concerned, as of this installment, this is the first time a MCU trilogy had been directed by the same director, given that previous trilogies, ranging from Iron Man and Captain America, had two of those installments be directed by one individual, while the other installment was directed by someone else. And upon Spider-Man No Way Home's theatrical release, on top of getting really good reception from critics and audience members alike, it also became not just the highest grossing movie of 2021, but also became the overall 7th highest grossing movie of all time, and setting several other box office records. And sometime later, an extended version of the movie, subtitled The More Fun Stuff version, got a global theatrical release in September of 2022 to celebrate the, at the time, 60th anniversary of the Spider-Man franchise. Not only that, but Spider-Man No Way Home also did start this trend of having a bunch of other superhero movies incorporating the multiverse storyline into their narrative in some shape or form. And many fans claim that Spider-Man No Way Home is one of the best, if not the best, Spider-Man movie to date, even though that's what they all said about Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Which begs the question, is Spider-Man No Way Home really that good? As for the plot of the movie, with Mysterio revealing Peter Parker's secret identity to the entire world, Peter is desperate for help, and in his time of need, he seeks out Doctor Strange in order to make him cast a spell that would make the entire world forget that he is Spider-Man. However, upon Doctor Strange about to cast the spell in question, Peter accidentally botches the spell, resulting in the multiverse being shattered, bringing forth a group of monstrous supervillains that all seem to have a personal vendetta against Spider-Man, even though Peter himself has never encountered a single one of them. Can Peter and his friends fix the multiverse, or will his consequences result in its destruction? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, I love how ambitious this movie is in regards to having this connect with other Spider-Man movies, in the same vein as X-Men Days of Future Past. Because with X-Men Days of Future Past, when that movie first premiered, it did something we never saw before, which was taking two different generations of actors and having them take part in the same story, which had never been done before. But with X-Men Days of Future Past, it's using characters that came from the same film franchise. With Spider-Man No Way Home, on the other hand, on top of having this be a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe where we get to see the Tom Holland Spider-Man interacting with Doctor Strange, we also get to see him interacting with characters from some of the other Spider-Man movies, such as the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, along with his three villains of Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, and Sandman, along with interacting with the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, along with his two villains, the Lizard and Electro. And seeing Tom Holland interacted with all of these different actors and characters from not just the same franchise, but from different movie continuities is something that has never been done before. Even just thinking about the idea of having three generations of actors who've played Spider-Man ranging from Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland simply interacting with each other, regardless if it's them shooting the shit or fighting all the villains together, is just so surreal. Another aspect of the movie I liked kind of connects back to the previous point, revolving around a certain cameo, that being the cameo of Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil. Because going way back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe during its Phase 2 run, where they were not only producing the Phase 2 movies, but you also had the creation of the Netflix Defender shows. And when these shows came out, the movies did not in any shape or form acknowledge the existence of these shows. Sure, the TV shows themselves did periodically acknowledge the movies, but you never saw any of the Phase 2 or Phase 3 movies acknowledge the existence of the Netflix Defender shows. So it is nice that here's a movie from, of all things, Phase 4, to at least acknowledge some aspect of the Netflix Defender shows, even if it was just a cameo in the grand scheme of things. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the way the movie reintroduces all of these Spider-Man villains from the previous movies in a way that tells the audience these characters are back from the dead, with Dr. Octopus and Green Goblin literally appearing out of smoke first as if they came from hell itself, to the Lizard popping right out of the shadows, Electro taking on this ghostly apparition when we first see him, to seeing Sandman literally rising out of the ground. And I know technically speaking, the character never died in Spider-Man 3, but when we do see Sandman for the remainder of the movie, he doesn't take on his normal human form. Instead, we see him quite literally as a man made of sand, showcasing that he has lost his humanity. And I feel that this was done due to the fact that the filmmakers were using a lot of the de-aging technology on Alfred Molina, which looks fantastic, by the way. And I think they only had enough in the budget to de-age one actor, and I think de-aging him made sense, and having Sandman be literally a man made of sand, I thought was a creative way to get around the whole de-aging thing. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the ending, because it gives us a status quo that is both new but familiar with Spider-Man. Because one of the biggest problems a lot of Marvel fans have had with the Tom Holland movies is that they don't really resemble the Spider-Man from the comics, given how too different it is in some shape or form. And yet, when we get to the end of the movie, it gives us a new status quo for this incarnation of Spider-Man that is more in line with what most people think of when they think Spider-Man. Sure, getting to this new but familiar status quo was a bit of a slow burn, but I do think it was worth the wait. Another aspect of the movie I liked is seeing the various interactions between certain characters from certain Spider-Man movies, with my favorite being the interaction between Electro talking to the Lizard. Because it starts out being very heartfelt at first, because you have to remember, Max, before he became Electro, was this employee that was essentially a nobody because everybody seemed to have ignored him or disrespected him, unless it was Gwen Stacy. So, seeing Dr. Connors as the Lizard actually talk about Max in a way where he's like, "Oh yeah, I remember you. I see you got quite the makeover," I thought was a very touchy moment, which then leads into a very comical moment between the two of them, ending with Sandman calling them both idiots and to shut up. I thought was just great. And while on the topic of the villains, another aspect of the movie I liked is how certain villains got updates to their costume designs that are meant to be more reminiscent to their comic book counterparts, with Dr. Octopus wearing a trench coat that's more green in color, that's meant to be a callback to his green jumpsuit from his early days in the comics, to having Green Goblin wearing this torn up purple hoodie, and him wearing these goggles during the climax, which I thought was a nice touch, given that the goggles are meant to be a callback to an unused design from the first Sam Raimi movie, which I thought was a nice touch. And then you get to Electro, who has maybe the most improved design of the villains, because his appearance in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, despite the movie being called The Amazing Spider-Man, the design for Electro was more influenced by his Ultimate incarnation, where he did wear a simple black jumpsuit and was bald. Whereas his wardrobe in this movie is more reminiscent to his classic green and yellow design from the comics. And although it's not a one-to-one translation, you can at least tell that it was heavily inspired by his classic design. And I thought having the electricity surrounding his face to make it look like his original mask from the comics was a nice touch, where it's meant to harken back to his classic mask from his early days, but it updates it in a way that fits this universe. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the movie's darker tone, at least in comparison to the previous two Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, because from the time this movie begins up until the climax, the stakes, both externally and internally, are raised immediately and keep getting higher as the movie progresses. Because this is the movie where we actually get to see this incarnation of Spider-Man be more reminiscent to the comics, where we see that a lot of his actions do have consequences. Everything from having his friends get rejected from MIT because they're simply friends with Peter, to even trying to help out the villains that way they don't die when they go back to their own dimension, results in the death of his aunt. And we see a lot of the internal struggle that Peter has throughout the movie. Another aspect of the movie I liked is Doctor Strange's role in the movie, in that it's more in line with how Iron Man was used in Spider-Man Homecoming, because one of my biggest worries going into this movie was that it was heavily advertising that Doctor Strange was going to be a major part of the movie, and I thought this was gonna be like Spider-Man Far From Home, where Nick Fury appears quite a bit throughout that movie, which I thought kind of took away from Spider-Man in some shape or form. With this here, he's used in the same way that Iron Man was used in Spider-Man Homecoming, where yes, he's in the movie, but he's used sparingly. Another aspect of the movie I liked is how this movie celebrates 20 years of Spider-Man in a cinematic sense. And I know what you're all thinking. This movie came out in 2021. Spider-Man's 20th anniversary, at least in a cinematic sense, wouldn't be until 2022, which also coincidentally would be Spider-Man's, at the time, 60th anniversary within pop culture. But the logic I'm using here is that if the filmmakers behind 2023's Godzilla Minus One considered that to be the movie to celebrate 70 years of Godzilla, even though Godzilla's 70th anniversary wasn't until 2024, I could use that same logic for this movie. And I thought this movie did a good job of celebrating 20 years of Spider-Man in a cinematic sense, both the comical and serious. And what I mean by comical, I think around 2018 when Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse came out, I do remember seeing these fan posts where people were discussing the idea of loving to see a movie where you have Tom Holland, Andrew Garfield, and Tobey Maguire Spider-Man interacting with each other, with them discussing the idea of a scene of them preparing for a battle by having one of them say, "Load up your shooters," with Tobey Maguire just shooting his organic webs, kind of showing off that he doesn't need to load up. And they do exactly that here, where we actually do get to see Tobey Maguire not only shoot and demonstrate that he can shoot his webs organically, but I also love the fact that you actually get to see the Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland Spider-Man talking to him about how he's even able to shoot organic webs as opposed to making cartridges that shoot webs, which again I thought was hilarious. But I also love how this movie also captures some of the more serious moments from the Spider-Man franchise, with the big example being the moment where we see the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man saving MJ, and just a little interaction between MJ and the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man at that moment in terms of how he reacts to saving her, I thought was a really nice callback to the moment where he failed to save Gwen Stacy from The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And now we get to see him redeem himself in that sense. And not only does this movie, celebrate some of the best moments of Spider-Man in some of his movies, but it also manages to acknowledge some of the problems that people had with certain Spider-Man movies, which I thought was a nice touch. And not only that, but we also get to hear music cues ranging from Dr. Octopus and Electro's themes from their respective movies, to even seeing each of the Spider-Man do their iconic poses during the final battle in this movie. Now, as for aspects of the movie I have mixed feelings on, the CGI used in this movie is very hit and miss. Because on the one hand, there's some points in time where the CGI looks really good, especially when it comes to the de-aging of certain actors such as Alfred Molina. And some of the particle effects used for Electro's electricity or Sandman's sand look pretty decent too, but there are other points in time where the CGI doesn't look all that great, to a point where it doesn't look fully rendered. The lizard being maybe the worst offender of this, because I feel like most of the CGI used on him looks like the type of CGI I would have seen back in 2002 to 2004, somewhere in that time frame. And yet, this was a movie that was made in 2021. And when comparing the CGI used for the lizard in this movie to how it was used in the 2012 Amazing Spider-Man movie, it's no comparison. The lizard in the 2012 movie looks so much better and has CGI that actually has aged relatively well in some areas, whereas the CGI here, man, it looked dated on arrival. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the pacing, because I think the pacing for the first and the last act of the movie are paced very well, but it's not until you get to the middle act of the movies where I think the movie drags quite a bit, because there's really not much going on, in my opinion. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the death of Aunt May. Because on the one hand, I do think that it is refreshing to have a live-action incarnation of Spider-Man where instead of having Uncle Ben die for once, it's actually Aunt May. And I do like the fact that it's not done in the first movie, but in the third installment, to at least try to make this incarnation of Spider-Man different from the previous two incarnations in some shape or form. But on the other hand, I think my biggest problem with killing her off is that her death in this movie, one, feels very anticlimactic in that sense, where when she initially does die, it was a case of, really? That's it? It just felt so underwhelming considering what had happened prior to that. And second, her death, I don't know if it's me, but it just didn't feel earned, in my opinion. Because on the one hand, her dying within the context of the story is actually very necessary for Peter Parker's character development within the movie. But the problem with her death scene is that I didn't care for it. Because unlike the previous two incarnations of Aunt May from the Sam Raimi or the Marc Webb movies where you really got to know that incarnation of Aunt May, this incarnation of Aunt May, you don't really spend that much time with. Especially in Spider-Man Far From Home, where she just shows up as a glorified cameo at the very start of the movie and appears ever so sporadically. And not only that, but unlike the previous two incarnations who had no idea Peter Parker was Spider-Man, this incarnation of Aunt May at the end of Spider-Man Homecoming fully knows that Peter is Spider-Man. So you would think that there would be a bit more emotional tension between her and Peter in this set of MCU Spider-Man movies, but that tension's not there. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the multiversal narrative itself, which I find to be kind of hilarious because in Spider-Man Far From Home, that movie simultaneously both introduced and got rid of the concept of the multiverse. And then you have this movie, which happens immediately afterwards, which reintroduces the multiversal concept properly by having the Tom Holland incarnation of Spider-Man interacting with characters from the Sam Raimi and Marc Webb movies. And although it was really cool to see the Tom Holland incarnation of Spider-Man interacting with the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield incarnations of Spider-Man along with their villains, I just think it was a little too soon to make a story like this. And why I bring this up, let's rewind the clocks back to when the idea of having a third MCU Spider-Man movie was still up in the aired because of the Marvel Studios Sony disagreement between the two. Because at the time, no one knew if there would be a third MCU Spider-Man movie. But when there was an agreement made between the two studios thanks to Tom Holland, there was a set of rumors going around about what the plot of the movie would have been about. And the biggest recurring theory I heard was that the movie would have been an adaptation of the Last Hunt storyline from the Spider-Man comics, where it would have featured Kraven the Hunter being the main villain chasing after Peter Parker, which would have played out like The Fugitive but with Spider-Man characters. And it would have ended with Spider-Man confronting Mysterio again, who turned out to be alive and well, but was made into a fraud thanks to Norman Osborn. And after all that was said and done, apparently the post-credits scene supposedly was gonna be Doctor Strange arriving to Peter Parker to make him an offer about whether or not he wants the world to forget he's Spider-Man, and that was the initial rumor at the time. And in some ways, I actually would have preferred this storyline, where we get to have a villain that's not heavily reliant on technology, that would have been more of a physical match for Spider-Man in some capacity. And the movie sounded like it was going to be really dark as well. But somewhere down the line, the director decided to just drop the idea of having Kraven the Hunter be the villain, and decided to gravitate towards a story idea similar to the 1946 Christmas movie It's a Wonderful Life, and decided to incorporate Doctor Strange into the story, which led to the creation of this movie. And here are my problems with the movie having a multiversal storyline. First off, I thought it was a little too soon to introduce that type of idea into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Personally, I feel like maybe this could have been the basis for a fourth Tom Holland Spider-Man movie. Second, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think the idea of having a Spider-Man movie where he fights Kraven the Hunter would have been a really great idea. But I get this gut feeling that maybe the real reason why Kraven the Hunter wasn't used as the main villain for the movie has to do with the fact that Sony is producing the Spider-Person's cinematic universe, consisting of a bunch of Spider-Man characters such as Venom, Morbius, Madam Webb, and Kraven the Hunter, without actually featuring Spider-Man, because it just feels like the director and Marvel Studios were trying to cash in on the popularity of the 2018 Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse movie, because that movie just broke so much ground in terms of its characters, storytelling, and multiversal concept, which, in my opinion, is the dumbest idea ever. But then again, this is Sony we're talking about, and their track record with Spider-Man has not been the best, and they clearly don't learn from their own mistakes. But with that all said, I get it. I understand why this particular movie was made, because a lot of these actors aren't going to be around forever. And not only that, but the superhero genre in recent years has died down quite a bit, to a point where they're not the juggernauts that they once used to be. So it feels as if this was meant to be the last hurrah for not just the Spider-Man franchise, but just superhero movies in general. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the people's reaction to Peter Parker being Spider-Man. Because I like the fact that it's not everyone is all for or against Peter being Spider-Man. There's an actual split between people, where you either have some people who think Peter Parker is the devil for killing Mysterio, or you got some people who view Peter as the hero. And while the public's reaction to Peter being Spider-Man definitely has influence over the narrative, I just feel that this aspect of the movie could have been utilized a little more, because as it sits, it just felt a little underdeveloped, with maybe the biggest offender being the underutilization of Flash Thompson, because in the past two Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, it's established that Flash is a big fan of Spider-Man, but he hates Peter Parker. And you would think, with him finding out that Peter is Spider-Man in this movie, you would think he would have a bit more of a mixed reaction, where he's not only angry, but he's kind of jealous of the fact that Peter is Spider-Man. But the movie doesn't do that. Instead, they have him write a book saying how I was friends with Spider-Man, and he's really happy about it. it just feels a little out of character, and it just felt like a really missed opportunity. But like I said, I felt this concept was a little underdeveloped. For the first problem that I have with the movie is a nitpick, that being the treatment of some of the more miscellaneous characters from the other Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, such as Flash Thompson, Betty, the teachers, and so forth. Because on the one hand, in the grand scheme of things, they're not my favorite cast of characters, and they are just side characters in the grand scheme of things. But what really bugs me about the way they're used in this movie, they show up for the first 20 minutes, and after the first 20 minutes, they just disappear for the remainder of the movie. And I just feel that, even though, again, they're just side characters, I feel like they kind of added something to the previous installments that is severely lacking with this installment. And not only that, but I just don't think those characters had the right kind of send-off. Because the moment they appear, they just disappear as quickly as they appeared, serving as nothing more than glorified cameos, with the exception of Flash Thompson. But even then, like I said a few moments ago, around the 20-minute mark, he also just disappears, and none of these characters are ever, again, seen or mentioned again for the remainder of the movie. Now for my first major problem with the movie is the lack of establishment of the other universes. At least in regards to the characters from the Marc Webb movies, because when you have Doctor Strange and Peter talking to Otto Octavius, that is how they establish one other universe exists at that point with the characters. But then fast forward to the bit where you have Electro talking to the Lizard, and during their conversation, it cuts to Ned and MJ talking. You hear Ned say they're from the same universe, implying that they hail from a different universe, which is the correct case. But how do they know they're from a different universe? Because for all they know, these villains could have came from the same universe, even though that's not the case. And why this bugs me, they actually had an opportunity to bring this detail up, but they never did. That detail revolving around Dr. Connors. Because remember, in the Sam Raimi movies, it is established that Dr. Otto Octavius is friends with the Sam Raimi incarnation of Dr. Connors. And I feel like there was a moment where maybe when you have Peter taking MJ and Ned and they have a conversation with Otto Octavius, maybe there should have been a moment where Ned looks over, sees the Lizard, thinking he's a dinosaur, and then the Lizard addresses himself as Dr. Connors, which gets the attention of Octavius because he knows Kurt Connors. And then they get into a conversation realizing that they're both from two different universes, which would have made sense later on in the movie when you have the Lizard talking to Electro. Another problem I have in the movie is how this movie contradicts plot points from other movies. For example, when you have Dr. Octavius talking about his death, it's not the same as it was in the movie, because in Spider-Man 2, Octavius gains control of his four tentacles and sacrifices himself to destroy his own machine and save the city. Yet, you fast forward to this movie, and when you hear him talking about his final confrontation with Spider-Man, it is completely different than how it actually played out. Another example comes from Electro, because within the context of this movie, it's established that Electro knows his Spider-Man is really Peter Parker, which makes no sense considering that in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Electro never finds out that Peter Parker is Spider-Man in that movie. Sure, Harry Osborn in that movie does, but not Electro. The only thing I could think of is maybe somewhere off screen, that version of Harry Osborn told Electro who Spider-Man really is, but again, it's never established. Another problem I have with the movie is that Peter Parker makes the same exact mistake he made in Spider-Man Far From Home, which is trusting one of the villains, in this case being Norman Osborn. Because here's the thing, with Spider-Man Far From Home, that made sense, because for the first half of the movie, Peter is under the assumption Mysterio is indeed the good guy, until he finds out he's not. So him trusting Mysterio in that instance, and only for Mysterio to betray him, actually made sense in that context. But in this movie, it makes absolutely no sense, considering that, first off, this movie literally takes place immediately after the events of Spider-Man Far From Home. So with Mysterio's defeat fresh in his mind, he should not be as trusting with certain villains, such as Norman Osborn, especially Norman Osborn, who does the exact same thing, which results in a catastrophe that's far worse than what Mysterio pulled in Far From Home. Another problem that I have with the movie is the idea of Peter Parker trying to fix the villains in this movie, because I get that he's trying to save their lives and give them a second chance, but by doing so, wouldn't this alter or potentially erase the events of some of the previous Spider-Man movies? For me, it's just a case of I have a lot of questions that this movie is ultimately not gonna answer. Another problem I have with the movie is, not surprisingly, a villain problem. A villain problem that's very similar to that of Spider-Man 3 from 2007, which is it has a lot of villains, but not a clear central villain. And I know I've heard people make the argument that the Green Goblin in this movie is the main villain of the movie. And here's the thing, that is a statement I wholeheartedly disagree with, because to me, the Green Goblin in this movie did not feel like the main villain. He just felt like a regular villain that just showed up, much like the other villains. And from my understanding, apparently in the first draft of this particular script that had this multiversal idea, apparently that was the case, where he was just a regular villain for Spider-Man to fight. But apparently down the line, they rewrote the script to make him the main villain, yet that's not the impression I get when I watch the movie, because to me, he just never felt like the main villain. He, again, as I said, he just felt like a regular villain. And I think the reason why I feel this has to do with screen time, because I feel like if he had more screen time throughout the movie, that could have made all the difference. Where maybe during the first act of the movie, when he first shows up, maybe we get to see him traverse the city causing chaos, and then we get to see his reaction of realizing that this isn't his universe upon seeing the face of the Tom Holland Spider-Man. You could have had a moment where he sat there going, I could have fun here, and you could see him plant the seed to destruction. And why I bring up his lack of screen time, because, no joke, when I saw the movie the first time and saw him enter into the final battle, I forgot he was even in the movie because of his lack of screen time. And not only that, but his final battle with the Tom Holland Spider-Man, I found to be very anticlimactic, because the entire fight is nothing more than a curb stomp, and I hate curb stomp fights. Not only that, but the fight choreography to me was very lacking, and it wasn't as visceral as the final battle in the original Spider-Man movie, because when you saw Spider-Man fight the Green Goblin in that movie, it was bloody, it was brutal, and you remembered every single punch that occurs between both Green Goblin and Spider-Man. This here, other than seeing the Green Goblin stab the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, I really don't remember the physical beats of the fight. Now, sure, one could make the argument that even though he doesn't have much screen time, what he does with it is very important, which technically is true, given that he does have some influence over the last third of the movie in terms of both the narrative and the character growth of the Tom Holland incarnation of Spider-Man. But I just wish he had more influence throughout the entire movie, and not just the last third. And honestly, I could go on and on about some of the other problems I have with the movie, but I think you get the general idea. So for my final verdict of Spider-Man No Way Home, I have mixed feelings about the movie, because on the one hand, when I do sit down and watch it, I really do enjoy the movie that we got, in that sense where we get to see Tom Holland's Spider-Man interacted with characters from other Spider-Man movies, to see actors such as William Dafoe, Alfred Molina, Tobey Maguire, among many others, reprising their roles from previous movies, to really enjoying the overall darker tone of this movie compared to the other two Tom Holland Spider-Man movies. And I do think out of any Spider-Man movie, this is perhaps the most ambitious movie to date. Not in a Avengers Infinity War or Eternals kind of way, but in its own unique way, because no one was really expecting this kind of movie. Which kind of leads to some problems I have with it, because it does ultimately feel like the movie is cashing in on the success and popularity of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, with its multiversal concept. And not only that, but this does lead to some problems ranging from continuity issues, characters who seem to pop in and out of the movie, and a lack of screen time for certain characters, especially a character like the Green Goblin. So, overall, Spider-Man No Way Home is a love letter to both the Spider-Man movie franchise along with its fans, even if it is a little messy at points. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Spider-Man No Way Home? So it looks like the movie got really good reception. I mean, don't get me wrong, I thought the movie was pretty good, but I didn't think it was that good. And so for my final rating of Spider-Man No Way Home, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So, what do you consider to be the best installment of the Spider-Man franchise? And see you later.